In this clip, we're kind of talking about mistakes that happened in history. But these mistakes wound up helping humanity, and it helped make an invention. In the 1920s, a Scottish scientist by the name Alexander Fleming was experimenting inside his laboratory. His main goal was to figure out a medication that could help cure diseases that were very common, because around that time, Spanish flu was very famous, so he was looking for a cure medication. His job was basically working inside his laboratory and experimenting with different chemicals, metals, and whatever you can find around the lab. Years after years, he doesn't really figure out anything, but he was determined to continue trying, and he wasn't gonna give up this easy. It is good to know that Fleming was a very disorganized person, so the laboratory looked like a mess, and he would leave things out for weeks and sometimes even months without cleaning it up. And that is why the things he left out sometimes would get moldy. And that's when we get to the year 1928. Just like always, Fleming was running his experiments. He gets finished with the chemical and realizes it's good for nothing, so he throws it against the moldy plate that he had laying around there. But to his luck, that liquid that he just made spilled out and spilled on the mold. But after that, he didn't think anything of it and went back to work. After a while, he went back to his sink to pick something up. Then he realized that the look of the mold has changed, and it seems like the bacteria has started moving away from the center of the mold. He took the moldy plate under the microscope, and he realizes that the bacteria has started retreating or even dying. He realized that the liquid he had just made is something special, so he started running more experiments with it. You could say that this liquid was the first antibiotic in history, penicillin, and it's still used to this day. If that moldy plate wasn't there and Fleming's hand didn't shake and it didn't spill on top of it, it would take a lot more years for us to figure out what an antibiotic is. So Fleming being disorganized and spilling some of that liquid on top of some mold was a huge mistake that invented something. Alright, let's go to the next mistake. In the year 1853, an African American worked in a restaurant by the name of George Spec. He would work as a chef, and he always had one customer that was a pain in the butt, especially in terms of potatoes, and he was always told that they are undercooked. After a few times of this customer complaining that it's undercooked, George Spec gets pissed off and starts cutting the potatoes extremely thin, where there's thin slices, and he puts it in the frying pan and fries them until they're extremely dry. He wanted to make it as cooked as possible since the customer was always complaining. He puts these dried out potatoes in front of the customers and tells them, "Is this cooked enough for you?" Once the customer tries it out, it seems like he fell in love with it because he really liked it. George Spec didn't realize, but he just made one of the first chips in the world. After this takes place, this type of food goes all over the US, and after a while, it goes all over the world. When George Spec created these chips, it was during slavery, but since he was in the northern area, there was none. But it's not like they were living in Jollyland. African Americans were still treated as third-class citizens. And that is why he wasn't really credited for the invention of chips at that time, and nobody cared about George Spec. 60 years passes, nobody gives George Spec any credit for chips, and this type of food has taken over the world. And after he dies in the year 1914, a New York newspaper by the name of the New York Tribune finally gives George Spec credit that he invented these back in the 1850s. At least one time after his death, they gave him credit. But nowadays, George Spec is known as the inventor of chips because of this incident in 1853. If George Spec wasn't so pissed off and that annoying customer wasn't always complaining, chips wouldn't be invented as early as 1853. Let's go to Canada. In this country, we had an electrical engineer by the name of John Hobbs. But with this, he realized that these frequencies help get the heart pumping. He didn't realize, but he had just invented the pacemaker. This is a very important invention because every year 600,000 pacemakers are inserted in people's bodies. And without this invention, a lot of people would not be alive. Alright, let's go to the next invention, microwaves. In the year 1945, a physicist by the name of Percy Spencer was working at a company called Raytheon. He was an engineer and a physicist that was experimenting on different wavelengths to figure out if they could make a radar that works better. One time Percy Spencer is experimenting with a new type of wavelength, and that's called the microwave. One of the people that was working near Percy Spencer had a piece of chocolate in his pocket. And after Percy was finished testing, they realized that the chocolate bar in his pocket has melted. So in their mind, they said, oh, the microwave creates heat. They brought another experiment. They brought a bunch of dried corn, put it in front of the microwave beam, and they turned it on. And slowly they realized that the corn is turning into popcorn. So they were convinced that it creates heat. But after more testing, they realized it's actually not producing heat. The microwave goes into the food or whatever it is and vibrates the water molecules around, and that causes heat, making the food warm up. The chocolate bar next to Percy Spencer caused the microwave machine to be born. So what's the next mistake? In the 1950s in Japan, we have an employee of Canon ironing his clothes in his house. He was cleaning up his clothes, but he didn't realize that in his shirt pocket he has left his pen. So like usual, he goes over it with the iron, and just like a printer, the heat of the iron causes the ink of the pen to spill out, ruining his shirt. Instead of him getting pissed off that he ruined his shirt, he thought of an idea, something that could be revolutionary. Why don't we take this idea and use it to print things on paper? Yes, the pen that was hiding itself from Ichiro's iron made the inkjet printer to be born. In simple terms, the inkjet printer works like this. Dry ink goes in front of the heat plate. It heats it up and turns into liquid, goes through a microscopic hole and spills onto the paper, printing something out. But laser printers have taken over the printer market, which is why you don't really see inkjets around anymore. But this was the invention that caused printers to be so advanced, so we have to appreciate that. Alright, let's go to the last mistake that allowed an invention to be born. In the year 1895, a German scientist by the name of Wilhelm Röntgen was experimenting inside his laboratory, and that's with different wavelengths of radiation. On December 1895, Wilhelm is confronted with a ray that we call X-ray. Wilhelm was kind of scared from this experiment, and he would call it the mysterious ray. And that is why in the beginning, when he would experiment with it, he would go behind a brick wall. We are not sure if he was afraid of the rays or he was afraid of it exploding, so he didn't want to be around it. When he would turn it on, a beam of blue light would show up as well, making Wilhelm even more scared. But he was dedicated to the task and wanted to figure out what this is. After a while, he realizes that it's not as dangerous as he thinks, so he started experimenting, but he was still careful. After a while, he got tired of it and impatient and said, "What the hell, let's try it out." And he put his hand in front of the ray to see what happened. And what he saw was extremely surprising, because he had made the first X-ray photograph in history. Wilhelm didn't know what kind of an invention he had just figured out, something that would save millions of lives throughout the years. You could tell that these inventions were mostly figured out because the scientist or inventor behind it would never give up, and they would continue working at it until they figure it out.